The Raising the Bar podcast, brought to you by the Association of Gray's Inn Students.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Meet the Barrister series for the Raising the Bar podcast with me, Alana Hughes. In the Meet the Barrister series, I speak to a different guest barrister in each episode and discuss their path to the bar and their practice. The aim of the Meet the Barrister series is to demonstrate that the bar is not a one-size-fits-all sort of profession, as it is sometimes wrongly assumed to be. Barristers come from a wide variety of backgrounds and specialise in many different areas of law. There is something for everyone. This episode will focus particularly on LGBTQ representation, inclusion and equality at the bar. My guest this evening is Gerald Wilson of Tanfield Chambers, London. Gerald was called to the bar in 1989 and specialises in family and property law. Gerald, thank you so much for joining me and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
So just to get started this evening then with tonight's episode, can you tell me a little bit about your background, how you came to the bar and why you wanted to be a barrister?
Well, I'm first generation in terms of going to university. I don't have a family background in law, but I was always very good at arguing. And I guess that I had a political motivation in coming to the bar. I wanted to change things. I wanted to be a voice for people. And initially I was in a general common law set, which was the norm in those days. There were very few specialist sets. And I've sort of slowly worked my way into family law. Initially, I did quite a lot of crime as well, and more property than family. But over time, that's moved, partly following the changes in lesbian and gay law in terms of the areas that needed to be changed. So I was very involved in the attempts to finish off the decriminalisation of homosexual offences, and then since then, equalising provision for people in family law.
Now, the focus of this episode is on LGBTQ representation, inclusion and equality at the bar. And just by way of context, you were called to the bar in 1989.
Yes.
The 80s were a very difficult decade for gay men in the UK for many reasons, but two reasons in particular were perhaps the HIV crisis and the introduction of the very controversial Section 28 of the Local Government Act 1988, which prohibited the promotion or teaching of homosexuality in schools. This was an act to refrain local authorities from promoting homosexuality. Politically, the decade was tumultuous for gay rights. The Prime Minister at the time, Margaret Thatcher, said at the Conservative Party conference in 1987, just 1 year, Gerald, before you're called to the bar, that children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay. All of those children are being cheated of a sound start in life. And then just 1 year after your call, in 1990, the World Health Organization declassified homosexuality as a mental disorder. Now, if we flash forward 30 years or so, same-sex marriage has been legalised across the UK, first in England and Wales, March 2014, and then Scotland, December 2014, and very regrettably, given that it's where I come from, only in January 2020 did Northern Ireland follow suit. But historically, LGBT inclusive relationships and sex education was introduced in 2020 in English schools after years of campaigning. But across the world, we still have 11 countries where the death penalty is imposed, or at least possible, for private, consensual, same-sex sexual activity. 72 countries who criminalise the same. Now that sets the scene and the background to show the difference in society in the UK from when you started at the bar to where we are now. And it's against that background that I ask you if you could talk about the challenges that life at the bar has presented to you throughout your career and how you have seen those challenges change as time has gone on.
The context was, in some ways, even more aggressively anti-gay than you've set out, because there was effectively a police campaign to prosecute gay men, particularly. There was a huge spike in the number of arrests and prosecutions for soliciting and gross indecency, and effectively an attempt to silence lesbians and gay men and prevent them from having any sort of profile publicly. The bar itself was extremely homophobic. When I arrived to do my first pupillage, there was no lesbian and gay society at the bar. There was a subgroup of a socialist society that dealt with lesbian gay rights. It was tiny. There were, I think, about 3 people who were out at the bar, at least that I knew of. One of them now is a High Court judge. But the atmosphere was very, very difficult. Indeed, in the judiciary, there was effectively a bar on anyone who was a lesbian or gay, or, well, there certainly were no transsexual judges at the bar then. And one recorder was forced to resign because he was outed by his boyfriend. So it was in many ways a very repressive time. And the change in the bar, I think, has been starting, really. I've personally had relatively little direct or overt discrimination, except at the start in pupillage, when I had my sort of lesbian and gay part of my CV on my CV. I got a pupillage at a radical set, but I got very few interviews. When I then took it off, effectively in desperation because I wasn't getting anywhere, I effectively got an interview for every set that I applied to. So that was a very stark lesson in homophobia at the bar. But of course, it wasn't just us. Women and black people had just as much difficulty. And there's been a lot of leadership at the bar in terms of pushing chambers and barristers to address minority rights and to take diversity seriously. And I think it really has absolutely changed the whole feeling at the bar.
There was an article that I read from the chair of the Middle Temple LGBTQ plus society, where he talked about the history of the inn and how we know when the first woman was admitted to the inn, and we know when the first black person was admitted to the inn, but we will never know when the first gay or lesbian person was admitted, and how that piece of history is sort of gone forever and we can't get that back.
Well, I think I think that latter point is quite a difficult one to address, because it is, unlike being black or minority ethnic or female, you can disguise your sexuality. So you can be under the radar, and there isn't a first lesbian or gay man at the bar, because there have always been lesbians and gay men at the bar, or at least gay men at the bar, because it's just that they've had to keep quiet about it. That's why we don't have someone who we can point to as being the first gay man who came to the bar. We might be able to point to the first lesbian, possibly, because of course women coming to the bar is a much more overt thing. So that's one element of it. The other is actually the fact that there were lots of closeted gay men, particularly at the bar, probably contributed to the homophobia at the bar, because people who felt threatened in their own positions because of their homosexuality tended to be, I think, quite difficult towards anyone who was out. They were threatened by them, and there wasn't necessarily the sort of solidarity that you might expect. But I think that's general in society. Closeted gay men and women are often the most powerful source of homophobia.
And to what extent does that problem persist at the bar today, in terms of people who are wanting particular positions, maybe within the judiciary or Queen's Counsel, for example, who feel that if they were to come out, that would be to the detriment of their career?
I very much doubt it now. I mean, these days, diversity is seen as a positive, particularly in terms of those sorts of appointments. The appointment systems are now they're almost algorithmic, at least at the start. And although there is an interview process, obviously, it's it's a much more objective process. And actually, your engagement in diversity, which is something of which LGBT people generally will have had significant experience of, is actually a positive in those processes. So I think now, at least the overt processes at the bar and in the judiciary, we're probably in a reasonably good place. There may still be processes which do still hinder people's careers. So, for example, there may be solicitors' firms that are actually quite boysy, if I could say that, laddish in their cultures, and you might find it harder to get work from those sorts of firms. It's that sort of thing, I think, rather than overt discrimination. And similarly, I think some chambers may be worse, but I think most chambers nowadays are generally pretty welcoming. But there may still be expectations as to where you're going to be, and I think there's a preponderance of out gay men and lesbians in the family bar as opposed perhaps to the commercial bar.
And what do you think could possibly be, the reason for that? Do you think that there's an element of liberalism and open-mindedness and empathy at the family bar that there maybe isn't in other areas of law? Or I suppose what are your thoughts on why there is a preponderance?
Well, partly it's that. Partly it's that I think a lot of lesbian and gay men, because of their experiences, tend to be more empathetic to people who are at the margins, and therefore, the sort of work that you do in family law is quite attractive if you're interested in dealing with people individually and with the sorts of difficult problems that arise. They're often because you're marginalised, because you happen to be someone from the subcontinent who has come here in a marriage and is struggling in that marriage, or there are all sorts of situations in which people are disadvantaged, which I think, because of our own disadvantage, we can empathise with. I think there's partly that push, but I think it's also partly that the cultures in some areas of the bar are more macho, to give it another word, or laddish. And that tends, to dissuade less lavish people from going to them. So women and gay men tend not to go into the commercial bar quite so readily, but also perhaps to find it harder to fit in, to get work in those fields.
If we look to how we go about changing that culture that unfortunately, very regrettably, still persists today, I know that you're a member of the Lesbian and Gay Lawyers Association, and I just wondered if you had any thoughts on what you would say to allies of the LGBTQ community who are out there in the bar, who are unsure of how best to support their colleagues, want to get involved, not sure how to get involved. What can they do? What are your thoughts on how to best push on to change cultures and change the perception of the community within the bar?
I think cultures change organically, so it's difficult, I think, to have particular sort of interventions that you can do. I think most cultures change because lesbians, gay men, and transsexuals become more open in those societies, play a bigger role, and the preconceptions about them change. And the more out you are, the more you talk about your own family rather than simply be silent about it when everyone else is talking about spouse and children and everything else, the more you will be included. So I think a lot of it has to come from us, but also people who are allies, I think, need to encourage that as well, and to be open to hearing and chatting about that sort of thing. To have some sense that actually, if you're just talking about the sort of life at home for straight people, that can sometimes be quite exclusive towards lesbians and gay men who may not have the same family setups and who might be a bit more reluctant to talk about their home life if everyone else is talking about the same thing. If their home life doesn't quite fit into whatever the general tenor of what everyone else is talking about. But I think now it's not really. It's much less about taking specific steps. It's much more about openness and generally being kind to each other.
In terms of your own openness, I know you mentioned that at the beginning you did put it on your CV, but then for a different reason you took it off. Is your sexuality and your home life and your personal circumstances something that you have always been open about and always been proud to be open about, or was there ever a time when you came to the realization that you were going to start being more open?
No, I was always, I mean, I was pretty open when I came to the bar. When I started pupillage, I really only took it off my CV because I needed to get a second sex pupillage, and I wasn't getting responses. And as soon as I did take it off, then really I had the pick of what I wanted to do. It was quite shocking in
Mm-hmm.
some ways, actually. And that was even for some radical sets as well, that there was that difference in approach. And I wasn't sort of back in the closet, as it were, for very long. So I wasn't out during my second sex pupillage in my new chambers, but within about 6 months of having a tenancy, I was open about who I was. And I was quite active politically. I was in a direct action group, so I did tend to be open. And it hasn't really been. Perhaps for that reason, I haven't really felt that I've had much overt, or if any, overt discrimination since then. Because if you're open to people, it's very difficult, I think, for them to be difficult back.
And with that, then, what would you say to any current member of the bar who wants to but feels unable to be open about their sexuality?
Well, it depends where that's coming from. If it's coming from a fear that you will not be properly treated at the bar, that you'll somehow be treated worse, I would say think again, because nowadays the processes are much, much more objective in terms of choosing people for pupillage and for tenancy. I don't think at my chambers you'd be at any disadvantage in being open about your sexuality. Whether that's true for all chambers, I can't say. But I think for a large proportion of the bar, it shouldn't be a problem at all. But it may be that you have other reasons for wanting to be reticent, and it's not for me to force people to be open about these things. But I think it also, if you are open, it makes it much easier to be yourself and to bring the whole of yourself to the work that you do. And not only does that, I think, make it much easier at work, it means you do better work.
How was it that you came to the bar with confidence in who you were and your true self, given the background of what it was like in society at that time?
The university I went to, and particularly the college I went to, was was very positive. I didn't feel that I should be at any disadvantage as a gay man, and actually coming out at university was relatively easy. Looking at jobs in the civil service, I started to find that there was homophobia out there in the jobs market, because there were certain roles I was not allowed to do. I wasn't allowed to join the Foreign Office, for example, or the Ministry of Defence. There was an absolute ban on gay men and lesbians being recruited. But I expected, because the bar is at the forefront of advocating for people, for changing the law, I thought it was going to be much more open than it actually was. It was way behind most other areas of work. And that was at a time when the discrimination provisions in relation to employment did not cover us. So you could be sacked for being gay or lesbian or transsexual. And yet employment was much better in terms of homophobia than the bar. But the bar was awful for women as well. Women were routinely asked as pupils what they would do when they had a child. They were routinely made to cry in interview to see whether they would stand up to a brutal judge. It was quite brutal in some ways. And since then, the bar has really modernised. It's a completely different beast, but it was very old fashioned. The one thing that I suspect is still difficult is for trans people,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't, I'm not an expert on it. So perhaps it's not really something that's sensible for me to talk about. But I suspect that much of the bar is still in a similar place with regard to trans people.
There just hasn't been the same change in society, more widely.
Yeah. And part of it is because lesbians and gay men have become respectable, which is something I've never been a fan of respectability, but I've been amazed at how important it's been in terms of general equality, equality on the ground, that we're now seen as fully respectable members of society. And that's because the homosexual offences have been abolished. I mean, previously, in the past, what was the main experience of members of the bar of gay men? It was prosecuting them for cottaging and soliciting. I mean, that's where a lot of this homophobia came from. And the other thing that's really changed how we're perceived is civil partnership and marriage. It wasn't something that as activists we were particularly pushing. We tended to want to push cohabitation rights, but actually having marriage as that sort of gold standard of relationship, with all the approval that comes with that, has made a huge difference.
I just wanted to ask you as well. It's no problem if you haven't, but have you seen It's a Sin?
I have, yes. It was great. It made me cry, I'm afraid. I won't tell you why.
Yeah, I haven't seen it yet. It's on my list. I'll need to get permission from my people supervisor to take off enough time to watch it. But I just wondered what your thoughts were on it.
It was very. I mean, it was incredibly sad. They were about 5 years older than me. So if I'd been born 5 years earlier, that's what my experience of coming to London would have been. Of course, by the time I came up to London, which was about 1987, there was much more information about HIV, and the culture was already quite different. But there were a lot of people who got very ill, and a lot of people who died. And it was only with combination therapies in the sort of early mid-90s that actually it stopped being a death sentence. So it was really, really sad to see that generation portrayed, and quite how bleak things actually were for a lot of them. Because I remember a lot of people who were perhaps slightly older than me, particularly mostly, but some, it wasn't so unusual for people of my cohort, my generation as well, and younger, to find themselves in the same position. So it was very sad. But do watch it. It's great fun, and it's just a blast. It's a blast as well. It's really fun.
My final question this evening, before I let you go, is one that I always finish off my podcast episodes with. And that question is, do you love your job? And if you do, why?
Yes, I do. I think I probably love it for all the reasons that barristers like their job. I mean, I like cross-examining. I like formulating an argument. It's great fun. I really like engaging with my clients and finding out exactly what it is they need. And basically, it's the problem-solving aspect of the work that we do that is really, really satisfying. And also, I've had the opportunity to engage with law reform over the period of my career, which has been very exciting. There's been huge changes in terms of criminal law and family law, and I've been some part in pushing those along, and that's been very rewarding.
Gerald, thanks so much. I'm actually on my feet in a few weeks at the family bar in London, so hopefully I'll get to bump into you, if not in person, then on a random Teams link somewhere. Thanks, Gerald. That was brilliant.
Thanks for listening to the Raising the Bar podcast. Please subscribe, rate and review. And for more information, check us out on Twitter @RaisingTheBarGI.